Welcome.
The Pathology Innovation Collaborative Community is a regulatory science initiative that aims to facilitate innovations in pathology, as well as advance safety and effectiveness evaluation. The PI Collaborative Community aims to harmonize approaches to speed delivery to patients through collaboration in the pre-competitive space. The PI-CC is open to all stakeholders, public or private, including but not limited to academia, industry, healthcare providers, patients, and advocacy groups. Meetings of this kind are an example of lawful activity under federal antitrust law, because the focus of the meeting is on government action or policy, including the industry's responses or positions taken with respect thereto. However, antitrust monitoring is needed for companies' own protection, since they are direct competitors meeting together. These meetings need to stay within protected subject matters and need to be monitored so that they do not stray off into inappropriate areas, such as pricing and price terms, sales and service territories for particular products, customers and customer territories, each company's individual decisions regarding selection of suppliers or customers, marketing plans and especially future marketing plans or new product offerings, other proprietary or competitively sensitive information. Today's meeting will follow the written agenda, and there will be no discussion of pricing or other prohibited topics. If the discussion veers into those topics, we will terminate the discussion. If you have any questions or concerns about the propriety of a discussion, please raise it immediately, and we will take a break to determine how best to proceed. The Medical Device Innovation Consortium acts as the formal convener, and we will follow their conflict of interest policy. For additional information, we defer to our Code of Conduct and our website, www.pathologyinnovationcc.org. We look forward to moving the field forward.
Just so we have some of the stuff documented. So as you have seen on the website, of course, there's the HITECH Act that incentivizes, of course, the collection of data when breaches occur over 500 plus individuals. And the aim of this project is, of course, we can look at all the data and the data is available. I think those were mailed around anyway for people to take a look at. But the concrete outcome was to create an infographic to potentially write this up in a brief peer-reviewed publication with some of the aspects that the various domain experts bring along. For example, relevance for litigation, medical legal implications, probably how to avoid this, right? That's probably on everyone's interest. And then we wanted to discuss sort of the scope, of course, in today's meeting, and then look at some of the data. And then, of course, any way, shape, or form in these multidimensional data sets to make sense of it or provide vantage points that are not on everyone's mind now, but that we can probably come up with would be great. That hopefully makes sense. Or comments on this? Probably
yeah,
not.
is
Yeah.
it a possibility, especially if we're thinking about this being a project where we're using data, maybe to at least have sort of a note here that just because these breaches have been disclosed doesn't mean these are the only breaches. There are a lot of companies and organizations that do not follow this compliance requirement. And so maybe a key question we should ask ourselves is, should we be using another data breach information source to cross-reference the data and see if there are gaps? As well as, what is following under the FTC's data breach notification rule for healthcare organizations that might not fall under HIPAA, and sort of what we should do to maybe make sure that either A, we're appropriately couching the data we have in any, anything that we're saying about it, or if we should think about the data set and if it needs to be augmented.
A great comment. So of course, the HIPAA breaches are of closest, let's call it, relevance to the healthcare sector, but it definitely would be helpful to have this. So, yep, I see, trying to follow the chat as well. Health adjacent companies. Yep.
Yeah, Fitbits of the world, they have other laws that may or may not constrain them. FERPA, what's the COPA? So there are other regimes that have other constraints, but may not involve a reporting requirement, or may not involve the same type of reporting requirement that makes this accessible to people. Might also be, in terms of infographics, it's like this seems, just looking at the data set right now, it seems very amenable to associating with like ArcGIS type data. I see you've already got your kind of summary of the state level data, but you can start thinking like, what are the demographics of those states, and how does this relate to the demographics? Do we have more people in California, but is California more secure? I like that may be a useless question, but a thought.
It's
And
great.
just a response maybe to that
Yep.
too. I think we do need to be really, really careful about the scope from a legal perspective, because we have a lot of different privacy laws, that could touch on organizations that do things that might be health adjacent. And I don't know if we want to go through a full listing. So for example, COPPA applies to children online internet privacy. So if there were a site that was about, let's say, for example, managing life with an insulin pump, and then there's a data breach associated with that, that's not something that's going to come under HIPAA. It will come under COPPA, but because it is health oriented, it should fall under the FTC's data breach notification rule. So if we were to say, for example, we're just going to focus on HIPAA's data breach notification obligation, which we know that there's a site, we have data, et cetera, and the FTC's data breach disclosure requirement for health companies that do not fall under HIPAA, I think we're going to get most of it. So just worth at least a proposal, so we don't get too lost in all the other options.
Well, of course, California is a great example, right? The Consumer Privacy Act versus the Privacy Rights Act, that I believe both went live almost in parallel, or went through the committees in parallel, but then got approved, I think, 2 or 3 years apart. Create even an intra-state heterogeneity about, I think, right of restriction, right of, rectification and all of that. But so I thought that the part that, I mean, we have to make sure that we have a somewhat of a scope, because all these points I believe are great to mention in the discussion. But I think the, let's say, lessons or the evidence that we can gather from the data and putting those into a light to ensure that, some of the health IT experts have sort of a, I don't know if it's a one-stop shop, but at least, let's say, raise awareness that this data is available and that it's actually relatively easy to mine. And then second, to say, if something happens to you, here is actually a resource where you can contact people, right, that have gone through something similar. And but I think these, let's call it limitations, and I'm not familiar with the FTC data sources and rules governing that, so definitely need to read up on that.
I could do a little digging too. Yeah, it's interesting what you're talking about at the state level, because right now we have, for states and territories, I believe it is 52 separate data breach notification statutes.
Yep.
So, and they're all different. They all have different requirements in terms of what needs to be disclosed, and not all of them are connected to a data repository. Some of them are, some of them aren't. And a lot of times information about, let's say, the sector of the company is not collected. So we wouldn't know if ABC company is a healthcare company necessarily, even if the data about the data breach is collected for that state.
I mean, just to say something obvious, I think just these points to me sound like a table of things to consider that you may have not
Yeah.
considered when talking about this sort of superficially. Let me just show you quickly, because you may have seen there was some analysis done on the right side of the table that was shared. So we looked, for example, into the, can you see this? I hope.
Yep.
It's out there. So the location of the breached information, of course, these are now the unique entries. But I thought that, for example, one thing that can be at least glanced, and of course there's reporting bias, etc. When you look at, email versus laptop versus server, and then, so the majority of events actually seem to occur at a network server. And of course, there's questions, can we align this with the hacking events, etc.? And then the other part, Niels, that you mentioned here, so this is state level information. I currently tried to parse this according to 3 layers. So I mapped this out. So one is the density by breaches, so just the total number of incidents reported. And that's sort of the density map. This is the density by individuals affected. So that's the total number of people affected, of course, by state. And then I was just working on relating that to the population in the state. I think that's, I need to sort this. That part I don't have yet, but clearly Texas and California with large fractions of the population seem to be affected disproportionate. But you can see even just by number of breaches versus individuals affected, there's definitely some differences visible here. The other part that we discussed briefly about the contractual components that are underlying this. So business associate versus a health plan versus a healthcare provider. It seems clearly that the most notifications through this route came apparently from the healthcare provider by a large margin. This is like 3 times as much roughly as the other 2 combined. I think that's a very interesting thing, but may actually be related to the points that you just mentioned, Charlotte, about which businesses are actually declaring themselves as healthcare, right?
So maybe a question for you too, is this identified within the data set as the origin of the breach, or is it identified in terms of who reported it? Because a lot of times a healthcare provider will want to report it, even if it occurs at a business associate's location, because they're in control of the notification.
So they call it the so-called covered entity type. So this is the type that reports it. Of course, if let's say I don't know, I'm making this up. If a payer would identify that, a hospital had a breach and then the hospital notifies it, it would still be considered a healthcare provider. But that, there's of course some assumptions in here.
Yeah, I mention this because under HIPAA, it's actually not required for the business associate to notify HHS or to file something through the website. It is required for the covered entity to do that, which means actually under HIPAA, the business associate is required to notify the covered entity. That's their only notification obligation. So it may be worth just noting that, it's possible that the reason we see this kind of a disproportionate, number with covered entities is not because the frequency actually, is only covered or primarily covered entities, but that's just who's reporting it.
There may also be and this was brought up by Jim Harrison, the kind of consternation problem where if a business associate reports a breach, but they don't report it to the covered entity, or for some reason it gets out ahead of the covered entity, the covered entity ends up in a bind with their patients who start calling about, hey, you just
Yeah.
my thyroid cancer results. And they're like, wait, what are you talking about?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
they can't manage the PR. You're so right.
So
Yeah,
it,
PR can be a catastrophe.
I like it to or even portray this triangulation, right? Where the business associate informs, let's say, the patient finds out, but the healthcare provider does not. Or especially, Charlotte, we used one of the use cases where, a lot of healthcare systems send out testing without having a business associate agreement. Basically, reference lab business where information is transmitted without even having a formal contract. And in that triangulation, it's very hard to trace who informs who.
Yeah, that was actually the specific example Jim brought up, was that oncologist was aspirating a tumor, sending it to a genomics company. The genomics company got hacked, and no one at the medical system knew about it until the patient called the lab. And the lab's like, we don't even contract with that company. What are you talking about? And now you've divulged to the patient that you're not contracting with that company. That opens another can of worms.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you are passing information, PHI, between two organizations, you fundamentally have a business relationship, whether you want to or not. And you're obligated, both of you, to execute a business associate agreement. So you actually have another HIPAA problem if that happens.
I think it would be great to illustrate this. So that, just to reiterate, or just to make sure that I understood this correctly. So the deviation here towards healthcare provider might be the consequence of the notification requirement, correct?
Exactly. Yeah.
Well,
And
I think,
actually, as Niels was saying, it could even be problematic that you have business associates notifying above.
this is it's really interesting. The other part that I did when looking at this sort of more vertically was with respect to individuals. Of course, they might be in part overlapping. These are not necessarily unique. But when looking at the grand total, there's 75 million individuals affected, close to 76 million. And this is over 2 years. So I just picked that date because that was, basically over the pandemic. I don't know if that plays a role, but the prior years don't look much better. But the total US population, at least an estimate over that time, was 333 million. And that would mean 23%, at least by raw numbers, sort of back of the envelope calculation of US population would be affected.
That's wild.
Crazy, right? That means 1 in 4.
Well, and then there's this other bit, and I dropped the DC3 link at the top of the chat. If you have 75 million Americans, like, think of some of the people that are probably in that data set, right? There's counterintelligence risk on top of everything else. There's counterintelligence risk. There's business intelligence risk. I'm sure somebody got the medical records of the CEO of Pfizer. They'd love to use that.
Yeah, I think this would be another element to go into the table, right? This is something I would have never thought of, but it's, of course, if you have 23% of a population at least theoretically reached, that sounds like you can do bad things with that.
And then there's business associates. there's a company called Griffon Scientific, and they got tapped for better or worse, they got tapped for this gain of function research, but it's really because of prior work they've done on counterintelligence risk of genomics companies. So some of the biggest genomics companies are Chinese, and if you're getting your genome sequenced by a Chinese company, the Chinese now own your genome. Which, God bless the Chinese people, CCP is a bit of a problem. And so you may be signing a business associate agreement with a company that may have relatively unknown data disposition rules. Like if you sign with Beijing Genomics, BGI, there's absolutely nothing that prevents them from transmitting your data to a foreign entity.
And kind of with that, I think just to add on, we have an issue about, let's say, the permanence of that data. You can't change your genetic code. So there's a degree of, let's say, sensitivity or identifiability about that data that I think is far different than what we usually see with data breaches. And that's true, I think, of a lot of health data, but in particular genetic data.
And I'll drop a link to this thing. That the actual PDF report is linked down at the bottom. There's a couple versions depending on how you want to reference it, but it might be worth grabbing those links in the chat.
Oh, yep, I have that, and we can add this to the website in sort of minutes of this. Briefly here, I think I may have added this table somewhere else, but it seems, at least by that the data reported, taking that with all the grains of salt necessary, loss, theft, and improper disposal seems to be rather small fractions, but then hacking or IT incident, of course, those are two big differences. One could be just a leak, and the other one sounds like there's an intended or an intention behind it. That would be also a good thing to at least discuss.
I'm also a bit curious. I apologize, I haven't done all of my reading necessary on this, but given how long this rule law has been in place, if we look prior to the pandemic and then over the course of time, how does this like, I'm assuming, increase or growth of breach over time, as Neil said in the chat? What does that look like? And then also, given that, I'm not quite sure, are these kind of breach reports coming out daily? Are they coming out monthly by the HHS? But where do we want to cap the most recent limit on the data? Yeah.
That's super important. So actually, I can talk about that briefly. So any breaches over 500 people have to be reported, I think it's within 72 hours of, and I'm going to say confirmation, because data breaches are notorious for sort of changing their shape and size. And sometimes you're not sure that you've had a data breach, but you think you might have had a data breach, et cetera, et cetera. But breaches that are less than 500 people can be disclosed at the end of the calendar year, which means that actually this is not a bad time to start, because presumably at least organizations that know what they're doing will have disclosed those smaller breaches too by the end of 2022.
And it's the end of the calendar year?
Yep, end of the calendar year.
Perfect. Yeah, I think we can, of course, look at the time trends as they have been reported, but I think this rule within 72 hours clearly applies to those big, large number data breaches. I think that might be the case, but I'm not too sure about the smaller ones. We could also cap that data and just say because of heterogeneity, we take it in, let's say, the global numbers, but not in the time trend analysis or so. So let me ask you, what do you think of these, let's call it these very simple, let's say, I think I added, these are the sort of key value pairs here. Which analyses do you consider most relevant, or which correlations do you think are probably most fruitful?
So if somebody's reading this, I think you're probably trying to get their, stimulate some fear and then tell them what to do about it. So where do you look? Obviously, like you said, the servers seem to be the thing. So type of breach seems pretty relevant. And then, there are some, might be worth discussing some of the things that aren't in this data set. Like, do we know, are they reporting who breached them? Are they reporting the level of investigation done on the breach? Can we resolve them down to the threat actor that did the thing?
Yeah, is it state sponsored or otherwise would be interesting.
Yeah,
What is the
actor.
effect? Is this actually a data breach or is this a ransomware attack? Like, what's the nature of the breach? Having reported these, I'm willing to bet money that we don't have that kind of detail.
No, I think this is again, I would say, topics that will immediately be raised once you look at this data, but it's probably not available at that granularity.
Yeah.
The part where the business associate agreement is present, we can probably correlate with the covered entity type to see whether that is.
Yeah, I think that's really good, Niels. Who is the who's the threat actor, or what is the category of threat actor? What is the type of attack, or what is the impact of the attack? How many people are affected? Like, what is the kind of ending affected size of the data breach?
Yeah, some of this, probably goes in discussion of like, here's stuff we don't know. There's a meta problem which HR McMaster would capture under the general umbrella of there's the concept of American exceptionalism. He calls it American narcissism, where we just put this information out and we're just advertising to anybody who's interested where our vulnerabilities are. And that's a whole meta conversation.
But I think many of the points that you're raising would fall into the group of this kind of question, right? Because we would like to probably have more granularity on capturing this data, while we can probably answer some questions with the data that's available. So those are like two different bins, sort of, to put this in.
So I think maybe the question I have is, are we at a point where we really know what the research question is, or are we at a point where we're really just trying to identify all of the sources of data that we could potentially have so that we can create sort of a super database on which we could form some potential hypotheses or form some research questions that we could actually test and sort of bear out? I say that because, today we have an annual report that HHS puts out on data breaches that draws upon the data they already have. So for example, what are the general types of trends that they're seeing and that kind of thing, which is okay. But we have an opportunity, I think, to really find some interesting relationships between data. All of you have data superpowers. I just work in the law area, but I certainly am very curious about what the state of this world is and what that means in terms of regulating it.
Yes,
So the
so
question is, what are we kind of adding to the table, I guess?
So I think it becomes immediately clear when just looking through this bullet point list that we are identifying gaps of the publicly available data. Now, whether those gaps should be closed or not, I think that's a second issue. But I think the idea for this project came out of two other privacy pilot projects. One, that HIPAA should be revised, and no one knows how. And to many researchers, the current privacy is already prohibitory or prohibitive, while clearly it's not enough. So it's kind of like this balance principle. What is the right amount? And when we discussed that, it was clear that this data has never been looked at from, let's call it, a laboratory or a physician perspective, to just say, how bad is it? So this is more or less like we tried to condense it down into a 2-3 page quick, infographic is probably capturing it very well, into a slide that there is definitely a problem, but it's much more multifaceted than we anticipate. So it is truly, there's not like a distinct research question in terms of like we asked ABC, but it was more raising awareness about the existing data sources and looking into it, what we can derive from it. And this business associate agreement issue, especially with send out of genomic tests, was one example case that we wanted to use to illustrate the relevance of this.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Is there a patient right to know that your genomics send out went to the Chinese Communist Party?
Currently, no. And genetic really interesting too, because you have a lot of organizations that are not under HIPAA that do a wide variety of genetic testing that would not be subject to these requirements.
Yeah.
But I think you have another slice here that's very interesting, which is sort of the degree we're concerned about adverse government entities having a lot of very personal information about citizens of the US, which is a different and very important question, I think.
Yeah, but part of this is, I'm putting a bunch of things out here, but I suspect, data scientist that actually has to write code is like, stop talking. But part of this is, just the exercise of like, what are we not going to cover, right? Like define the research question, but by defining what it isn't.
Yep.
No, I also think that many of these points are good in when we do start really like digging into this data, looking for the missing gaps as well, as we've been talking about. There's so many things that we can tell just by what isn't captured. That I think we need to put all of this onto the page to know what we're looking for in those gaps.
One element in medicine, so putting on my MD hat, is this very simple distinction between things you can change and things you cannot change. So for example, the analysis of how many people live in a state, you could argue, well, large states should have different measures or trackability functions, but that's something that's rather not controllable by an individual entity, while other things, for example, the configuration of your network server, is definitely in your control. So it might be interesting to look at some of these components which are more bottom up, meaning can an IT expert implement this, or is this something that requires larger scale, like top down, let's call it legal action, to say the breach report should entail more components? I'm sure there's two opposing forces here, but that might be a way to sort these elements here a bit.
Something else that could be interesting is, you were talking about the states.
Yep.
I would actually be very interested in an analysis that determines where the affected parties were located, not just where the organization is located or headquartered, but how far reaching were the effects. So for example, you have some insurers in some states that have had data breaches that affect 15, 20 different states. And in fact, we've seen litigation like that. Where you have attorneys general from a variety of different states who are bringing action separately under their state data breach notification rules or other security rules. And so just like even being able to plot that visually, I think could be fascinating.
But under the current notification rule, it would be, let's say, the payer is located in Illinois. All those individuals would be assigned to Illinois, correct?
That's a good question. I don't, we'd probably have to look at the form to see if you have to identify the states in which they're located. I don't know if there's information like that in the database that I put in the chat that has the sort of central repository for HHS data breaches and state breaches that are reported from the states. But perhaps there's a way to figure it out.
No, this is great.
And further on what you said earlier about each state kind of having their own rules, how do those rules affect when your patients are located in a different state? How do those rules overlap? Which I don't know if we'll have any information to figure out, but I'm at least curious.
Yeah, and a lot of that depends on how each of the laws is written. So some of the laws regulate just the organizations within their state. Some of the laws regulate behaviors that affect individuals living in the state, which could mean organizations extraterritorially located. Yeah, it's fascinating. And this is part of the problem and sort of why we've tried to pass a comprehensive data breach notification statute unsuccessfully 6 times. Because there are so many differences.
I mean, one way to frame this as a research question would be, why will it be so hard to revise HIPAA, right? Because this is currently in effect, and it's has been operating under the last 2 years, and the data that we're looking at, we could illustrate what we currently know about, let's call it cybersecurity of healthcare data. But I believe what we should capture, or what would, no one can probably right now conceptualize what a HIPAA 2.0 would look like, but just outlining the multidimensionality of the additional layers that one can consider without necessarily making that a condition or any sort of requirement, but just exploring it almost like a discourse to say, hey, look at all these different things. I think that might be a good way to frame the project.
Sorry,
I
I
do
was
think
off on a
it. Oh,
tangent.
sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think very shortly, I agree with you. I think that the question is, who is the audience? I think that could help to sort of shape what we're trying to collect. Because this could be relevant to a lot of different people, policymakers and others. But, if we're really trying to think about this from the perspective of people working in a clinical setting, or people doing research, or people in healthcare versus regulators or policymakers, I think that helps us narrow what we're trying to do.
So we, of course, initially thought about the potential regulatory implications, but the scope was really focused initially on, let's call it laboratory directors, people in the lab, who are, of course, always scared about, sharing and working with PHI. Then there's, of course, the research aspect of that. Many in the academic medical center want to do both. And then comes the part with this, business associate agreement. I wasn't considering that this has, policy or, legislative relevance, or, it might be informative to policymakers. We didn't discuss that before. Niels, Emma, what do you think?
My question is, if we want to shape this in a way that policymakers are interested in, how does that look different than shaping it for more of a research bend? I just don't think I quite know the distinction yet.
Yeah, I think there's some opportunities, like without changing the law, you can change a lot of administrative procedure that can move things in the right direction. Like you're pointing out with the FTC's breach form, what steps to mitigate. Like you could explicitly, you've got this big list of personal information and health information on the form. You could explicitly ask them on the form, which of the following steps have you taken to mitigate losses? Did you require a data sharing agreement that assigned differential privacy budgets? Did you require researchers to send their computations to the data instead of allowing data release at all? You could just change the form and affect behavior. I suspect, like if you change that form, I suspect IRBs would take notice.
I think the raising awareness of the multidimensionality of the problem, to me, is the most general and most interesting part. I had no idea that we're operating. I think, Charlie, what you said, is this affecting people beyond us, right? The example of genomics companies that are located outside the US, those are like sort of international issues. I think, as many of you know, we're talking about international data exchange policies or ways to do this. Of course, there's the whole GDPR incompatibility with, exchanges in Europe. National, what you just said, Niels, right? If we want to change the form, what would that take? And then there's probably state level. I put here regional. I don't know if there's another good way between regional, local, and actual individual level, right? So what can an individual patient expect? The right of being forgotten, etc. So just outlining that HIPAA and PHI currently is affecting these different layers and portraying against the breach report what we can glance from that, I think would be very interesting. Yep, agree with the comment in the chat about researchers' data sharing agreements.
Yeah,
Yep.
I type things so you can copy paste them. No plagiarism involved here.
Perfect. The other part is, of course, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just offering words of encouragement. Go forth.
The other part is, of course, the NIH has pretty broad data sharing requirements now, right? Especially for genomic data. That might be another layer to discuss here.
I mean, probably another layer, which maybe is a little bit of a tangent, but I think is relevant, especially in this context, which is, in what cases did folks effectively use privacy protecting technologies? That's, I guess, the lingo now, but back in the day, we just called it things like pseudonymization or de-identification, which is sort of a, I apologize for my frankness, but is a really crappy way to achieve a reduction in potential risk, but is still legitimate from HHS's point of view, and anonymization. But, of course, differential privacy and some of these others, uh, what's wrong with me? I'm forgetting the name. It's not correct data or real data. It's based off of real
Synthetic?
data. Sorry, synthetic?
Or imputed data?
Yeah, imputed data and synthetic data.
Then there's
But I'm
also,
just kind of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
on the flip side, there's, pushed by other folks trying to merge larger and larger data sets for efforts around real world evidence.
So true.
And these are legitimate competing concerns. You've got oncologists who are looking at, patients dying in a bed, like, I could have helped you more, against, other concerns. In addition to real world, the counterbalance issue of real world evidence. Oh, as you aggregate data aggregation increases risk itself.
Yes.
Bigger health systems are bigger problems.
Yes. And a lot of those health systems are purchasing data sets, screen scraping, and doing a variety of other things to complement their data sets, especially the big insurers.
Are you familiar with Acasa?
I'm not actually.
Oh, this is a great company. In terms of, it's like you never want to be a great patient. So I think it's AKASA. So they train computer vision algorithms to screen scrape the medical records. So, for example, Epic and Cerner will not give the Acasa direct database access. Let me back up. Acasa provides coding and billing support to hospital systems. So what they do, ideally, they would just connect to the database and do natural language processing. But Epic and Cerner will not give them database keys. So instead, they have their healthcare customers give them user accounts to their system. So Stanford's Epic and EVMS is Epic. I'm trying to think of people who have EVMS or have Epic. You can imagine now Acasa is effectively aggregating all of these different epics, and you don't even have an obvious connection, because what they're doing is they're going through all new claims and then logging into Epic as effectively a user, doing computer vision on the screen itself to deduce the characters on the screen and then do the natural language processing. Does that make any sense at all?
It's kind of like the, I don't know if you all remember back in the day, in order to convert a PDF to text or to upload documents as images that could be maintained in like online library databases, they had these very old school programs that could do this, but not at this level.
Yeah, it's not OCR. It's
Yeah, it's totally
it's
different.
computer vision, I presume, right?
no, I guess OCR is computer vision, but if you say OCR, kind of
It's not
puts a
OCR
date.
though.
No, it's that's the old school term,
It's
yes,
the
but
old school term, yeah.
yeah.
I just popped open their company website, and like the claims that they're making about saving their clients money are really just outstanding. Um that's a I didn't know about this. This is a scary concept. They're pretty much their claims are fully like we have an AI that will read it all for you, take away all of that cost that you had to put into having a person do that. It's yeah, that's another
And they're
uh,
doing it. Here's the societal issue. They're doing it because no one wants to be a medical coder. These Stanford is, having to pay coders more and more and more because there's a diminishing pool of coders in society, medical coder, not programmers, but medical coders in society. So you literally don't have the human resources to do this job without computers. So now you're up against another utility function.
Uh-huh.
That might be an interesting concept of like, let's think of some of the interacting utility functions, like the fundamental utility functions. Like, yes, I want real world evidence aggregated to large scale so that I can, provide better insights for my patients. No, I don't want aggregation because that creates increasingly larger vulnerabilities. But I also inevitably am going to acquire these larger aggregations because society is removing, the structure of the economy is removing the human capability that would effectively anonymize it because wetware brains tend to forget what they saw yesterday.
Oh yeah. I never thought about it like that, of course, we always want larger data sets to even help the rarest conditions, but aside from the risk associated with that of course removes that from being able to be managed by humans. So we're almost at the top of the hour, so I will work this out. I will send it around to this group before we add this to the website. And should we maybe for the next session go through this list and try to assign it to the different layers that or I don't know if layers is the correct word, but I think some of these are opportunities and some seems more like threats or problems or issues, or challenges, maybe challenges and opportunities. Maybe we can put like two columns here and assign these to these different layers to see whether there are any gaps that we haven't covered. Just to collect these, let's call it brainstorming facts.
This was like a great start. Jansen Sahalt said he was very impressed with your working methods. So appreciate the opportunity to see it in action.
Yeah. And it's
Uh,
fun to just start like just getting ideas on paper, like I'm sure that as we keep talking, things will start to coalesce.
yep,
We'll kind of figure out what it is we want to do with it.
perfect. So I put something together. I share it with this smaller group. We put it on the website, and then we see when we have our next meeting. I think that has been scheduled, and then I invite you to provide other good cross correlation ideas for the data that we have, so we can definitely plot this. What website? I'll show you. Here is the link. That's where all the material is located, and currently the data breach project is the top. It's usually just chronologically. If you look at the prior project, you see what the. So it's usually a good thing if you have papers or links to personal or otherwise books, papers, we can put them on there. It's usually great if you invite other people. You can just drop the link and say, hey, that's what we're working on. And it's usually a fast way of communicating and showing people what we've done so far. All right.
All right.